This episode of Skirmish Supremacy is brought to you by Reformation Brewery, the official beer of your game night. All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of Skirmish Supremacy. Tonight we are joined by Christoffer. I am going to butcher your last name, so why don't you go ahead and say it?
Sevaldsen.
All right, and Christoffer is joining us with his Kickstarter that is about to end called Black Void, which is a new take on a kind of dark, apocalyptic, Arab-centric RPG from what I can understand, but I'm not going to talk about it. You will. And, of course, as usual, we are joined by Nick, who is over there painting something at random. Nick, what are you working on, man?
Relic Blade, actually a swarm of rats.
Even better. Okay. So painting up some rats. Awesome. So, Christoffer, tell us a little bit about Black Void. Like, obviously, you've had a very successful Kickstarter so far. It's definitely funded 766 backers. At this point of the time of recording, there's about 54 hours left. So you're definitely out there kicking butt for what is this? Is this your first project?
Yeah, it is.
Awesome. So, tell us a little bit about Black Void itself and how you kind of came about the idea of it.
Well, Black Void sort of started maybe 15 years ago, and I've been working on and off on it for all that time. Sometimes years have passed where I haven't done anything, but then about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I decided that if this was ever going to happen, I really needed to put in the effort and put in the hours and do something about it. So I did. And it's been a progressive thing, because as you said, it's sort of a apocalyptic, well, more sort of like post-apocalyptic, but with a twist, because humanity got thrown off Earth and got scattered among the stars, and is now at the bottom of the food chain in this weird city called Lynn the Eternal. And it came about sort of progressively, so it didn't start out as that at all. It started as probably more your typical fantasy setting, and then the ideas just came and it progressed, and I have a fascination with the ancient Mesopotamian cultures, the Babylonians and Sumerians and so on and so forth. So I really wanted to incorporate that as well, and then I'm a huge fan of Lovecraft, which is to most people who've seen it, and then it evolved, and I was like, I really love sci-fi, but I love fantasy as well. So it's kind of like a sci-fi setting, but without the futuristic stuff. And I think I actually managed to achieve that quite nicely, and then. Yeah, and then other people got involved, and I got some artists that have really done an amazing job at bringing this to life. So yeah.
Awesome. So it's very much like ancient Mesopotamian, Babylonian culture, but in the stars in the future, post-apocalypse. So it I was kind of looking through it, and it kind of gives me I guess if you want to call it more of an Arabic John Carter of Mars feel is kind of what the vibe I was getting from it.
Right. Yeah, I get that. That makes a lot of sense. It has been compared to John Carter before, also to Conan, swords and sandals kind of feel.
Yeah.
And that definitely makes a lot of sense. Because one of the things I wanted to do was create something that's slightly familiar, but still outlandish and weird,
Right.
So taking the offset in something that people know, which is Babylonians and so on, but they don't know that much, because when people think ancient civilizations, they think the Greeks and the Egyptians, but that's been done to death. But Babylonia and the cultures from this area they're not really that known, and the mythology and the monsters and everything just fit really well into sort of the vision that I had. So yeah, but I guess you could say sort of John Carter with a 1001 Nights / Lovecraftian kind of tweak to it, definitely.
Yeah, I could definitely. I get that vibe because kind of looking through it, I didn't get a chance to read it all completely, but just keep in mind I just had the quick start rules. But
Sure.
I definitely got this feel that the Lovecraftian side. It's like, okay, is there going to be reference in here of like the Anunnaki and things of that nature? I could nerd out on this stuff all night because I'm a big fan of Lovecraft myself. But the idea of like the Anunnaki were this race that were superior, that kind of came before humanity, and of course, there's a lot of conspiracy theorists out there now about what the Anunnaki really were. Yep. So it's very rife and ready to go for an RPG.
Exactly. So, and Anunnaki will definitely be featured in the core rulebook. Maybe not as how the conspiracy theorists see them, but they will be there.
Nice. So yeah, let's dive in and kind of talk about the uniqueness and the fleshed out races and different things like that in Black Void itself. So you actually didn't decide to go the route of your typical, I don't want to say Dungeons and Dragons leveling system, but you definitely don't have like a linear character progression.
No. So the whole thing about it is that, of course, I've played Dungeons and Dragons, I've played GURPS, I've played Vampire the Masquerade, different systems, and they all have their advantages and so on and so forth. But this project, it sort of started with the setting, and I could tweak systems that exist to sort of work with that, but I wanted to do something that was tailored particularly to the Black Void setting. And I never really liked the whole idea with classes and alignments and so on and so forth. So I wanted to do something where you had, the diversity and the range to do pretty much whatever you wanted to do, but still keep it sort of simple. So character progression works in the same way as character creation, which is you get an amount of points, and then you divide that among your skills and attributes and traits and so on and so forth. That being said, there are different sort of progression paths, because you have regular progression, where you can buy your skills and abilities and so on and so forth. But then you have enlightenment as well, which is basically understanding of existence, which allows you to travel the void, to go from world to world and to actually go beyond being purely human. And then you have the concept called wasta, which is sort of sway or clout, knowing the right people in the right places, which ties into the whole setting of humanity being at the bottom of the food chain and fighting its way up. So basically what you do is you define exactly what kind of character you want to create without thinking, but does this work for fighter or mage or whatever, because there's no such distinction.
Right. So you can kind of make your character to be like the social thief that also happens to be really good with the sword because he kind of had to, so any combination therein. So progression in the game then is more of I gain experience, and then I apply that experience to improve abilities I already have or to gain new ones.
Exactly. And then there's one more twist to it, because the experience points that you gain, you can sort of save them, and then you can burn them in the game to gain an advantage. Sort of like you have with the fate points and dark heresy and so on and so forth. But you have a little bit more options. So because that kind of, to exemplify that you have experience now, so sometimes you can just really focus and use that, and then
Great. Okay, cool. So you definitely, you've got to take in the whole idea of like using experience as like, if you want to call it like the old quintessential hero points, where it's like, okay, I really need to make sure this succeeds. Let's go ahead and burn a little bit of XP to make sure that I progress the story forward.
You can do that if you want to. You don't have to, but you can save some XP to utilize them for that during the game if you want to. Yeah.
Cool. So I guess, yeah, let's talk a little bit about the system, because one of the things you really emphasized, even in the Kickstarter video, is that you wanted a system that was simple enough that could be adapted to many of the situations without like slowing down the progression of the story. So how did you go about accomplishing that?
Well, I wanted to do something that was simple, which means a one dice system. No exploding dice and all that stuff. That works wonderfully for other systems, but not for me. It needed to be fairly linear. So it's a D12. You add your trait modifier and you add your ability modifier, be that a skill or a power or attribute or whatever it is. And then you roll that against difficulty. And if you equal or exceed that difficulty, you succeed. And that's how pretty much everything works. So what I wanted to do was that in a lot of other games, you roll differently depending on what you want to do, or if it's a resistance roll and so on. In the Black Void, the mechanics are the same all the way through.
Okay.
So you roll a d12, you add a certain number of modifiers or penalties, and then you get the result, and that's what it is. Also, what I wanted to do is I wanted to introduce a little bit more, let's call it drama, in terms of using a d12 instead of a d20. There's a higher chance of you getting a 12 or a 1, which will add that dramatic effect. So it's been downtoned a bit in terms of not being game breaking or game determining, but you will have it occurring more often, these critical mishaps or exceptional successes and so on. But as an element to add drama to the story rather than to determine it, so to say.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. So walk us through like the process then of like, if Nick made a character, right? And his character was, let's call him really strong and wanted to like break down a door. How what? Obviously, strength is probably a skill in the game, but what kind of other attribute? What other kind of skills would he use to do something like that to kind of keep the story moving forward? Because one thing I've noticed in a lot of RPGs is you go to do a thing, then you got to stop, look, and then roll some dice, and then go back to doing the thing.
Right. So the way for breaking down a door, for instance, that would typically just be a straight up strength roll. So the GM would determine a difficulty depending on what kind of a door it was, and then you would roll the d12, add your strength modifier, and if you reach that difficulty with the roll, let's say it's difficulty 7. If you roll 7 or higher plus your modifiers, then you break down the door. Simple as that.
Cool. Okay, and then combat works the same way.
Pretty much. So combat is boiled down to sort of 2 steps. One is rolling initiative, which continues throughout the combat, and then it's choosing your action and resolving that action. Now, where it diverges a little bit is that I've introduced quite a few combat maneuvers. There's 39 at the moment. To get away from combat being typical, I hit, I roll for that, I strike, I roll damage. But what I wanted to do was to create some more interesting combat, so you can choose specifically your maneuvers, beyond your typical called attacks and so on and so forth. But so instead of just engaging an enemy, you can charge the enemy, which will give a damage bonus, for instance, or you can do a furious charge, which will allow you to maybe knock down the person you're actually charging, and so on and so forth, to actually really create some dynamics in combat rather than just your stab, slash, blah,
Yeah. And
then obviously, depending on the intellect of the opponent, they have limitations on this. So if you're fighting a rat, for instance, now that Nick is painting rats, that would be fairly limited in terms of it can do a standard attack. But whereas you, as a player character, can do a lot of different things in order to resolve this combat.
So, like, I could choose to split the rat in half with my giant axe, or I could just step on it.
For instance, you could use an action called an all-out attack, which would give you a +3 modifier to hit, but it would also give you a -3 to your defense because your entire focus is on actually hitting your opponent. which
Right.
would leave you open and vulnerable, for instance. Or if you're up against a superior opponent, you could choose to take the defensive stance, which would you couldn't actually attack, but you would get a bonus to your defense value, meaning that you would be more difficult to hit. Also, you would be able to work in tandem with your fellow characters. So let's say you are two facing one opponent, you could block your opponent's attack on your fellow character while he attacks the opponent, for instance. So there's introduced, so the basics are simple, but the options are many because there's so many different things you can choose to do. And unlike a lot of other systems, you can do everything. You might get penalties if you don't have the appropriate skills, but you can always try to do it.
Right. So, like, if you've never cast magic in your life, you could again,
Well,
skills are
mysticism works a little bit different because you have to be void marked to actually have access to that. But within everything else, yes.
okay. So yeah, let's talk about that void marked thing, because I noticed that you did have a few powers in the book. How exactly does like your magic and your mystic ability work?
Well, there's two kinds. There's blood rituals and there's mysticism. Blood rituals is basically that you sacrifice a living creature. And then you can do that in different ways. One can be to gain a boon or fortune, which is a temporary bonus that the recipient would get. That could be that for the next 12 hours, for instance, you would make an exceptional hit on all rolls of 11 and 12s instead of just your 12s. So that's one thing. The other can be divination, where you can actually ask a question and then the GM would have to give you an answer to that question. But it's probably going to be pretty ambiguous and so on and so forth. But It's to add to the story as well, because this is something that has been going on in history as well, looking at the entrails and looking at the omens and so on and so forth.
Yeah, casting of bones, things like that. It gives you a direction, but it's never like this is exactly what will happen. It's just like I sense danger in the morning or something along those lines.
Exactly, or opening your eyes to an amount of options that might be open to you and so on and so forth.
I just want to go back to this blood rituals. I just all I could think of the whole time you were saying it is I'm taking Tim along, and every time I want to cast something, I poke him, squeeze a little blood out.
It's more than that, because you actually have to kill whatever it is you're sacrificing. So it works in a different kind of way, and the game is best suited for extended sandbox games. It can work for one shots, but that's not what it's ideally suited for. So there are, it is a bit more complex with the blood rituals than that, which is also why you gain the boons and fortunes that last for quite a long time. So also the more potent the sacrificial creature is, the greater the boon and fortune you're actually gonna endow to the recipient. And if you go to actually sacrificing a sentient being, then all of a sudden you get some pretty good bonuses. But then you have to get to this creature and so on and so forth. So obviously there's some dangers involved with that.
Right.
So that's one of them. Then you have mysticism, which requires that you are void marked. So the black void cosmology is that you have the cosmos on one hand, which is the world that we know. And then on the other hand, you have the void, which is chaos and catalyst. So it's form on one side and it's matter on the other. And between these, you have the veil. Now, the veil is what shields these two spheres from each other. But if you become enlightened, you can actually understand this and you can perforate the veil and you can travel the void and so on. But since the void is catalyst and change, it can actually affect you as well. So that's one way to get void mark. The other is if your parentage is from some demonic being and human on the other side, then you obviously have the void seed in you as well. When you have that, you can actually utilize that to change reality by actually sort of imposing void influence on it. So that's more in line with what you would normally call magic.
Right.
And the way it works is that everything is more or less improvised. So you have certain domains such as life, matter, void, so on and so forth. And then when you want to manifest a phenomenon, what you do is you select from different lists of effects, and that gives you a difficulty, and then you roll towards that. And if you equal or exceed it, then you actually manifest this phenomenon.
Okay.
So it's very versatile because you can do whatever the situation requires, but obviously it's also difficult because the more potent the manifestation is, the more difficult, of course, it is to reach. And if you roll a 1, then you have a calamity, and something's going to go terribly wrong.
Right, as it should. So
Exactly.
I guess let's kind of using the blood rituals and the mysticism. Let's kind of walk it through like a D&D trope real quick, right? Like, let's say your character is void marked and wants, you're in the middle of combat, you want to huck a fireball, because that's always like the the typical D&D spell. When in doubt, fireball.
Magic missile.
Well, magic missile makes more sense than fireball because while you can do the effect of fireball, it's not that common because the thing with magic is that it's sort of downgraded. It's a little bit more subtle than what you typically would see in your D&D settings. And the more unreal it is, so to say, the more reality is going to push back.
Right.
So if you do a fireball, that's going to be exceedingly difficult because that doesn't really occur naturally, So reality is going to push back to that. But what you do is you look at the tables. You have your duration, your range, your effect, and so on and so forth. So let's say you wanted to do something akin to magic missile, for instance, which is to cause a certain amount of damage. That would be maybe for 2 points worth. If you want a distance of 9 meters, that would be an additional 3 points. You want it to be instant, that's maybe 1 point. And then you add all of these factors together and you get a difficulty of, let's say, 9, for instance. Okay. Then you roll your dice, you add your appropriate trait, which typically would be willpower for mysticism, as well as your ranking within mysticism, which is basically how capable you are of doing this. And if you beat that difficulty, then the phenomenon manifests, and you actually cause damage to this creature.
Okay, cool. So
I like that.
It's pretty easy to do on the fly, and then obviously a lot of that is interpretation up to the GM. So if you have that, you have that guy that constantly wants to just fireball the crap out of everything, the GM can be like, yeah, that's going to be a difficulty 12. It's like
you just calculate it yourself because you have the table and you can see if I do with this effect, it's going to be exactly that difficulty. If I want to ramp it up, so instead of causing D6 damage, I want to cause D12 damage, then it's going to be 2 points more on the difficulty, which is obviously going to make it a lot more difficult. What you can do as well is you can create known and signature manifestations, but you have to pay experience points for those. But then you actually have a more easy time manifesting that particular phenomenon.
Okay, so in a way you can start
signature spell kind of thing,
Yeah, so you can start adding like your own imprint to the magics that you do.
Exactly.
So if like Nick wanted to fire his own magic missile and it said Nick was here on the side as it hit things, he could do that.
That's happening.
You do that, yeah.
All right, cool. So I definitely like that because I remember everything you were kind of saying about like building the difficulty, reality pushing back. The first thing my mind went to was Mage the Ascension.
Yeah.
If you've ever played that,
Mage the Ascension is awesome. So
yeah, where it was like, okay, I'm about to do this thing. How many people are looking? How many of them are magic users that know that I can do this? And then how many of them are like muggles? I guess is a better way to put it. Like, how much am I having to twist reality, and how much is this going to bite me in the ass for doing so?
Yeah. Which worked very well for Mage. So the difference here is that it doesn't matter how many see you and so on and so forth, because it's sort of naturally occurring, sort of says. The only thing pushing back is reality itself, because the cosmos is sort of stuck in its way. So whatever sort of pushes that normalcy, it will push back, which is also why you don't have things such as magical permanence, for instance. All manifestations are temporary. which is also why you don't have magic items and such.
That was going to be my next question, is whether or not that meant that there was no magic items.
There are no magic items. However, what I have done is I've introduced a customization system for weapons and armor and items, so you can create customized weaponry so that you can kind of have that effect, but it's not magical items.
Right. So like you go to a swordsmith and you make a sword that's specifically balanced for you,
exactly. So
and
you
the way you
perfectly
fight.
balanced and perfect grip and so on and so forth. So, and depending on what kind of weapon it is, so you have your shafted weapons, your bladed weapons, and so on, and then you have different options. So you have the general options that apply to all weapons. You have some options that apply only to bladed weapons, such as a twin point, for instance, which would give your weapon a piercing ability of 1. You could have the perfect grip, which would allow you to make an exceptional hit on an 11 and 12 rather than just a 12, and so on. And then you can apply up to 5 customizations to one weapon, depending on what kind of weapon it is. So you can really have something that just screams, "This is my custom weapon," you know.
Right, and then you could give it basically the ability, like most games, like the named blade.
Exactly.
This is my blade. If somebody takes it, I'm going to want it back. Cool.
Exactly.
I like that. So obviously we know there's humans in the game. Are there other races that people can play?
No, not that they can play. So the whole point is that it's about humanity being thrown from Earth and ending up at the bottom of the food chain. So what you can do is you can play pureblood, which is basically just human descendant from Earth. You can play a half-breed, which is half human, half something else, which allows you to take inhuman attributes. So for instance, those characters can have horns or wings or antennae or claws or sort of whatever they want from a long list of attributes. Or you can be void marked, which is human but touched by the void, so they can have attributes as well, and they can have some more esoteric powers such as mysticism, for instance. But they're all basically human, at least to a certain extent.
Okay, so it's not like there's, well, a Babylonian equivalent, I guess, if you want to call it that, of dwarves, elves, orcs, all that running around.
It's based in Earth as it actually is, but then obviously you have all the other species, but they're not playable.
Cool. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the lore that's been added into it. So obviously, Black Void is your own twist on the Mesopotamian Babylonian culture. What have you drawn from them to, I guess, if you want to say, pull monsters into the game?
Well, some of the mythical monsters that you have from Babylonia are there, such as, like we talked about, the Anunnaki are there as a species. You have the Lamazu. You have the Mardhora, which most people know as a manticore, but that stems from the Persian area as well. You have the original ghoul, but it's spelled Ghul. Which is not an undead creature at all. It's actually a jinn. So you have some of those in there, but mostly the ones that aren't really that much explored in other settings, because like we talked about, Egypt is well known and so on, but the whole Mesopotamian is really not that known in the public mind. So I wanted to take some things that are sort of familiar, but then a lot of it is gonna be, just things that you've never heard about before.
Cool.
So again, a mix of something that's familiar and a mix of something that's original.
Cool. So I know that you mentioned there's a lot of Lovecraftian influence to the game. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we could go down that parallel of the Anunnaki are very Lovecraftian in their own way. How did you go about kind of balancing some of the Lovecraftian side out? I know you kind of talked about the void itself and like there's, the chaos is, it's kind of matter and what was you say, substance that was kind of creating this chaotic pushback against reality. So how did you go about handling that and making it into a mechanic for the game? Not that I want to talk straight mechanics, but turning that into lore that makes sense for what you're doing.
I think where the Lovecraftian influence is probably in the areas where you wouldn't think it was. So how you travel from world to world through the void is actually probably one of the most inspired things. Because one of my favorite work by Lovecraft is the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. Yes. And the way he sails there in these galleys and so on, that has inspired how void travel actually occurs. And beyond that, I think it's more the mood rather than the specifics. So it's that there is stuff out there and it's terrible. And it's not terrible because it means us harm in that sense. It's terrible because it doesn't care about us. And that ties in with the whole notion of black void, where humanity is really at the bottom because everybody just thinks we're inferior. So it's sort of more in that sense. Obviously, there are some tentacles and teeth here and there, but I try to steer away from direct parallels because I don't want it to just be another Call of Cthulhu clone. I want it to stand on its own, and I think so far at least it's people can see the influence, but it's not hopefully at least trope Lovecraftian.
Right. You don't want to have something that's just like, a Shoggoth just running around for no reason, which, for those of you that are not Lovecraftian, the Thing is basically a Shoggoth.
Mm.
So
exactly. I wanted to veer away from that, but sort of retain So one of the things that Lovecraft did very well was the building of suspense and something that you kind of know what it is, but then you don't. And that's one of the things that I really like about him, which is also why a lot of these void entities will not be described granularly in detail, because to me that takes away all fun. Same as with the Predator movies, for instance. As soon as you could actually see them, it kind of took the fun away. It's when it's in shadows and your imagination really starts building. That's when it works, for me at least. So that's kind of what I wanted as well. Whereas, with Call of Cthulhu and so on and so forth, everything has been described in such detail, which is awesome. But I wanted to go the other direction, where it is the great unknown, it is the mystery, and it is humanity that has been put into this unfamiliar cosmos where they don't really know what anything is, And I tried to retain that by not being too granular in at least in those descriptions,
Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I kind of dig that. So obviously with that, though, you've probably made your own, I guess you want to call it, monster manual of like your own stuff. You're like, let's just put this in the game because it's cool. Mm-hmm. Nice. So when the book comes out, obviously I'm looking at a quick start.
Yep.
Because there's always going to be this question from game masters who want to just kind of jump in and start playing. Is like, okay, I want to start running this. How many monsters are in the book for me to work with, and how many do I have to kind of work on myself?
Right. So there's gonna be the way it works is that there's the sentient species, which will probably provide the majority of the opponents that you're gonna see, of which there are 21 sentient species right now that are going to be fleshed out in the core book. And then there's going to be probably around 25 sort of monsters. And then there's going to be a certain amount of creatures or animals as well, which can also function as for encounters and so on. But what there's also going to be in the GM section is sort of a guide to how to make your own both your species, but also your monster and creature species. Because one of so in the beginning, I've never really dug playing real pre-made adventures and so on and so forth. Everything has sort of been homebrew. Mm-hmm. And I want to allow GMs to do that as well. So, but I want to give them the tools to do it so that it makes sense in terms of the greater cosmos and so on and so forth. So there's going to be a guide for how to make a monster or an NPC species that actually works for you. That being said, you can also tweak everything that's in there, because since there's not levels, same as you have in D&D, people might think that, oh, okay, so how do I make sure that this encounter actually is on par with the capabilities of my players and so on and so forth. And there is a pretty simple key to that, which is basically look at how many points and experience points does your party have, and then you can actually put that on a scale towards how powerful should the opponents be. So even though you have a certain monster, you can quite quickly adapt it, tune it up or down to fit the difficulty you want a certain encounter to have.
Or you could just be a real jerk and just throw like the biggest, nastiest thing at them to make them realize, hey, maybe you shouldn't mess with this right now, Chuckles. So
exactly. Yeah, and the combat is definitely harsh and gritty. I mean, if you make too many mistakes, you're not gonna get out of it alive, or at least uncrippled.
Right. So I guess that's one thing we didn't really talk about too much is like combat is pretty fast and deadly in this game. It's not like you could take 7, 8, 9, 10 sword hits and just keep on going.
Yeah, true.
So yeah, it's definitely you gotta pick your battles.
Yeah, and you gotta. I mean, you know, because everybody loves a murder hobo, but at some point it just gets a little bit boring, you know. Right. But so I wanted to introduce it in a way that you don't just jump in, because again, it ties in with the whole setting. Humanity is at the bottom, so if they just run around and think they can kill everything, they're gonna have to think again, because that's not gonna fly for them. And that's one of the reasons why I introduced this pretty harsh way of doing it, and also to add to the excitement, because one of the things that I've found is that a lot of people, they never flee. You know, characters, for some reason, they never flee. It's victory or death, you know? And I wanted to get away from that, because that opens other opportunities. So you might lose half the battles, but you still might succeed at whatever it is you're trying to do, right, but just in a different kind of way, you know? And it adds that tension that there should be to combat, because if you're never gonna lose a combat, then you know, where's the excitement? Then it's just gonna be roll 3 dice and then whoever rolls highest wins, you know. So I wanted to make it gritty and sort of, if not realistic, then at least believable,
right?
And have, you know, crippling injuries and such things, so that if you get beaten, you're gonna feel it for a long time, you know.
Yeah, I like that, because, you know, as you were saying, it's like there's so much in RPGs where people like want to stand their ground into the death and all that, and they think about like all these heroic characters they know from myth, and you know, kind of, of course, everybody's epic hero they always think of as Conan, right? Like, Conan is the man; he will fight anything. And it's like, it makes me wonder if people actually read the books where he's, you know, because how many times has Conan fought things and he's like, nope, I'm out. Like, he's just like, I'm not dealing with this. You know, even after he kills something like God in the Bowl, you know, the snake with the human head that was wearing the mask, he decapitates it, the mask falls off, and he's like, nope, this is getting too weird for me, and he just takes off. Exactly.
It's that reality thing to it that I wanted to reintroduce. And also, this is not your typical game of good versus evil or everybody's heroic. This is survival. And for that to work, it has to be harsh and gritty, you know, because otherwise it's just, and it makes it hopefully stand out a little bit as well, you know.
Yeah. You know, obviously we've spent a lot of time kind of talking about the combat and monsters and things like that, but there's a lot of what I see with the game too is that you could definitely make this much more of an intrigue game. It doesn't have to be all about stabbing people in the stomach.
True.
Because I noticed that, you know, even in the quick start, you added a lot of the culture and things like that. So how would a GM that's used to, I guess, more of the D&D style go about playing this game as more of like an intrigue and, you know, still making sure the characters progress? Like, how would a GM go about doing that?
Right. Well, the thing about making a good intrigue is making something that relates to each character and their ambitions. So one of the things that there's in the book a chapter called Coming to Life, where you flesh out all the stuff beyond just the numbers on your character sheet. And for me, one of the fun parts about GMing has always been looking at the motivations of my characters. Why are they running around like this? It's not just to kill orcs and so on and so forth, but what is the actual motivation? And then to intertwine that in the story. So there's tons of ways of doing it, but one thing is that humanity basically wants to reassert itself, to become something again rather than just being at the bottom. And that means interacting with all the higher castes, because this is a very hierarchical society, and humans are low caste or casteless. And the only way to progress on this ladder is to actually interact with the aristocracy and the higher castes and so on and so forth. And that means gaining favor and wasta, if you want to get into the mechanics of it. So it's much more, or it can be much more about creating these contacts and doing favors for these people, and then you will gain favors back and so on and so forth, which is also why you have the backgrounds in the character creation, for instance, which leans much more towards this type of play rather than your typical hack and slash. But it's, one of the key things is that GMs need to align with their players what kind of game it is they want to play. Because if you have somebody who just wants to run around and kill things, then maybe introducing too much intrigue and diplomacy and so on is not going to be fun for everybody. So you need to have players that really thrive on this, or at least on a variety of things. I mean, for me, that's the thing that's fun, where you can have several play sessions where there's actually no combat and still be extremely thrilling and exciting, So the fundamentals are there in the mechanics to run this kind of game, and when I do adventure modules, I try to make sure that there's always various paths to reach the goals. I don't like railroading. I always want to make sure that there's at least 2 or 3 different ways you can move from one scene to the next. So there's no sort of beaten path where you have to beat this monster at the gate, otherwise you can't progress any further, And one of those options always has to be a non-combat option, which sort of perpetuates that type of gaming as well.
Right.
I hope that answers it.
Yeah, it does. So, but you kind of mentioned the mechanic of wasta, and we kind of talked about it a little bit. But how does that play out in game? Because in a lot of games, you take games such as like Fate and other games that kind of uses a lot of that intrigue, and it just kind of becomes like, I now have this contact, or I can now ask for this from this person. How does wasta become its own kind of unique thing within the game?
Well, it to a certain extent it works a little bit like that, but so there's you have the caste system, which is very specifically the hierarchy. Now, wasta works in addition to that, so it is that the right people in the right places, and they can help you, but they will not do it only because you have gained wasta with them. It's a give and take kind of thing. But from a mechanic point of view, yes, you do get bonus modifiers when you deal with this particular entity or faction and so on and so forth. Or you can burn that wasta. So you actually, if you really want something which is sort of above and beyond, you say, can you help me with this? And if you manage to convince the entity of that, and he or she does help you, but then the wasta point is gone, meaning that then you don't have that connection anymore because you've sort of utilized that contact to its full extent.
Yeah, you burned all your favor.
Kind of, yeah, exactly.
Cool. I really like that because it kind of creates a way to, I guess, mitigate. For a lot of people, one of the things that I've talked to about them in the past is that the reason why D&D is so popular is that you don't have to be an improv actor, if you would,
right.
Because you always seem to have those two camps. It's either murder hobos or improv actors, and there's not a lot of that meeting in the middle. Right. So, by having a system like wasta where, maybe somebody isn't that good at like the role playing side of things, where they could say, you know what, I'm going to burn the wasta to get the thing. At least as the GM, yes, you're going to try to flash it out and make the story, more intriguing than just you burnt wasta, got thing. But the mechanic is still there to allow the person that may not be as good as the role playing side of it to still progress without
Exactly.
needing to take improv classes.
Exactly.
I like it.
Yeah, it's definitely a fresh take on how a lot of that is typically done. Because even thinking back to games such as like Fate, or even back in the day, I used to play a lot of Mage, Vampire, and Werewolf, and it was always like, okay, yeah, I've got the skills to do these things, but you still felt like you had to act it out, and there were just certain people that was not their jam. They just couldn't do it.
No, exactly. And I mean, one of the things that I write in the GM section particularly is that, GM should award good role playing, but that doesn't mean that if you don't really have that particular in you, then it's out of the bounds, So yeah.
Cool. So from a GM's perspective, how easy is it? I mean, so we talked about the mechanics and the simplicity of the system and how it's very easy to modify it on the fly. How easy is it for a GM to kind of come up with, I don't even want to say a one shot, but let's say like a micro campaign, 3-4 games done, or even extend this out where they're playing a game for 2-3 years. How much prep time does a GM typically need to get a session, if you want to call it that?
That's a good question. That depends on the GM, I have to say. I mean, one of the things that I'm doing in the core book is that for all the areas and worlds that are described in there, there's going to be plot hooks that can be utilized. So in terms of that, there's going to be inspiration throughout the book, and once you have the let's say the basic premise and concept down, it's pretty simple, because you can fit a lot of things into this setting and it still makes sense. I mean, but the basic premise is that humanity is screwed and they're trying to get to a better place in life, and that's the outset. And with that as an outset, pretty much all options are open. So it should be fairly simple, but obviously it's difficult for me to say because I invented the whole damn thing. So
You're like, I can do this whenever I want.
But I try to give as much help as I possibly can by introducing these plot hooks to all the different areas. And also one of the things that I have in the bestiary, for instance, is that so you have your description, your behavior, all this stuff. But there's also a point called threat, which is how can this monster or creature actually be a threat to characters in the game, which again is sort of a plot hook for okay, I need a monster that could be a problem in this situation. Which one kind of fits that? Okay, this monster could work for that situation.
Cool. All right, yeah. So it's very easy to adapt on the fly, even if
I hope so.
Yeah, because that's the other thing too. Is I know, again, thinking back to your typical D&D, I don't want to say it's made to be on a railroad, but there's so many adventures out there that it's like, I decide I'm going to do this thing differently, and then the GM's kind of stuck like, I got nothing. So
yeah, true.
At least with this, it's kind of like, okay, I decide not to fight big bad monster.
Exactly.
What's the consequences?
And that's one of the reasons why. So I have the module When Darkness Falls, which is already written, and then we were lucky enough to unlock stretch goals, getting John Creffield and Dan Cross to do 2 more. So it's actually going to be a trilogy. So there will be sort of a blueprint on how a typical Black Void adventure model could or should be. No, scratch the should, because there are no limits. I don't want to impose limits on the GMs or players for that sake. But it gives you sort of a blueprint of how, in my mind, it should work. And like I said before, there should always be more than one way of going about resolving anything. And there's one thing I always do as well is I put sort of arbitrary events in that the GM can throw in if he or she wants to add drama or to diffuse the situation and so on and so forth. So there's always sort of a parabola of different options available to the GM if the players do something that's completely unexpected, and I've multiple times tried to run this, and the funny thing is that every time, obviously, the players they do it differently, and strangely enough. And the first time I ran When Darkness Falls, the intro scene, which was supposed to last 20 minutes, managed to run for 4 hours because the guys just would not give up on this thing. So they just did everything they possibly. So it was an abduction scene, and they would just not let these guys get away with the abductee. So, and then at one point, one of the guys, he wants to jump after a boat and grab onto the railing, and I'm like, well, I don't ever want to deny a player a chance to do something. So, all right, on a 12 you manage to do it, and of course he rolls a 12. So
it's like, son of a bitch.
And I'm like, no, that's the only thing that wasn't supposed to happen. You know, so these things have taught me some things as well, that there always needs to be, you know, a helpful tool for the GM in case they find themselves in deep water. So that's what I'm trying to do when writing adventure modules.
Yeah, I like that, because then it leaves it open to enough interpretation. But, you know, it's something Nick and I have talked about when it comes down to, like, you know, more of your simulationist system versus like heavy narrative system, is that there's got to be something where if this thing succeeds or fails, it makes sense to what is going on.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's always been an important thing, because, you know, I've seen that in, you know, playing in some Fate sessions, for example, where I'm like, you know, like trying to connect the dots as how the thing happened. And I'm like, but the logic is so skewed, and I'm not playing like some weird alien game where they could do what they want. Like, what the hell just happened? How is this a thing?
Right.
So, you know, I think that's important, where it's like, you know, okay, having the interpretation, but allowing people to have the flexibility to take that interpretation and move it how they want. Yeah. So, like in the case like that, where you're like, yeah, you can grab the railing, rolls a 12. Okay, now what? Well, you know, you can move it from there.
Exactly.
Cool. Awesome, man. So you only have a few hours left of this thing, but how has the feedback been on it so far? Like from play testing through just like online discussion, how's everything been moving for you on that?
I've been blown away by the response that I've been getting on this. You know, it started as a passion project, just something I sort of did for me. But I've always had in mind that I really wanted to try to take it beyond that. But the way it's been received and what people have said about it, it's absolutely blown my mind. It's because one thing is that I like it, but to actually have other people be enthusiastic about something that was just like 2 years ago was more or less completely in my head. That's just insane. And, you know, to see so many backers supporting this and wanting it to succeed and writing me. I mean, I had a guy from Russia yesterday who wrote me that he would want to translate the quick start into Russian for me if I was up for that. And, you know, just stuff like this is just incredible, you know?
Yeah, that's got to be a massive, like, I don't want to say stroke of the ego, but, you know, it's got to be a massive point of pride where you're like, wow, people dig my stuff enough that they want to take the time to translate it. And I don't know.
Exactly.
I don't know if you speak Russian. I know I don't. I'd be like, okay, yeah, go for it. You know?
Exactly. I mean, you know, and I'm just so happy to see people share my enthusiasm of it. I think to me, it's more than stroking the ego. Obviously, I'm very happy with it, and it does give me, let's say, more confidence that what I do actually makes sense to other people than me, which is, you know, always a good thing. But you know, to see somebody sort of share my vision and my dream, and then it becomes theirs. That's the most amazing part. You know, when people, like, I read that, and to me that means such and such, and I'm like, wow, that's better than what I ever imagined. You know, then it really takes on a life of its own, and that's I think that's probably one of the most incredible things about this whole thing, that people take ownership of it,
right.
And that's amazing. So, you know, in the comment section on the Kickstarter, for instance, backers have begun replying to each other's questions. And that's when you know that you've reached another level. Obviously, I still keep an eye on it to make sure that they say the right thing, but so far they have done that all the time.
Well, it makes your job easier.
It does, and it shows that people sort of they feel that it's theirs, and it is theirs. So that's really incredible.
Awesome. So obviously, by the time this goes live, your Kickstarter will unfortunately be over. Will you have a late backer pledge?
I'm gonna create a web shop.
Okay.
Where people can get the things, but it's not going to be your typical backer kit, pledge manager, and so on and so forth.
Okay, cool. So you will have options for that.
There will be options for that, yes.
Cool. And then do you have any plans right now on retail release or distribution?
I am looking into different distributors because my big dream is to see this in stores across the world. Obviously, that would be incredibly amazing. So I am looking at different options. I haven't decided on anybody yet. But so the PDF versions are going to go out in September is the plan, and the physical packages are going to go out in November, and hopefully that will coincide with distribution in retail stores as well. That's awesome. The plan, at least. That's the plan.
Awesome. So where can people find you right now to do everything Black Void, be it Facebook, Twitter, all that? Where can people plug the things?
All the handles are Black Void Games. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Instagram is my main thing because it's visual and I really, really like that platform. So just search for Black Void Games and you will definitely find me. And also there's blackvoidgames.com where you can sign up for the newsletter and so on and so forth. And then through the Kickstarter as well, of course.
Great. Nick, is there anything else you want to throw in there?
I have to say the art, you said you're visual and the art's really good because there's been at least twice that I've looked up at the camera as you've been talking and I've been like, dude, there's somebody about to stab you behind you. So for the listeners, he's got one of those big advertising posters, sheets set up behind him. And,
banners, yeah.
And it's pretty epic. I looked up and I was like, what the hell is going on here? So the art style is definitely amazing with this. And thanks for coming on and sharing.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Awesome. Well, that's going to end this episode of Skirmish Supremacy. Thanks for listening, folks, and we will see you next time. Thanks for listening to another episode of Skirmish Supremacy. To see more of the antics that Nick and I do, you can check us out on Facebook at Skirmish Supremacy. We also have Twitter, which we can be reached at Skirmish Supreme, because apparently Skirmish Supremacy does not fit in Twitter. And if you want to email us directly, you can reach us at tim@skirmishsupremacy.com or nick@skirmishsupremacy.com. Thanks for listening.